December 1st, 2009. Inside a courtroom in Manhattan, everyone held their breath. The jury leader stood up to deliver an important note. The jury was stuck. They couldn't agree on any of the charges. This meant a mistrial. The trial was over with no winner. This was the fourth mistrial in a row. John Angelo Gotti was the son of America's most famous mob boss. He stood up, straightened his tie, and walked out of the courtroom as a free man once more. 4 federal trials with charges of murder, racketeering, and drug crimes. Dozens of witnesses who used to work with criminals came to testify. Many of these witnesses were confessed killers who traded their stories for easier punishments. But not one conviction stuck. People called his father the Teflon Don because nothing stuck to him. Now they were calling John Jr. the Teflon Son. How does the son of a bloody criminal empire, someone who was trained from birth to rule the Gambino family, beat the full power of the United States government not once, but 4 separate times? This is the complete story of Junior Gotti. We'll talk about growing up in his father's shadow, the empire he took over, the fall of the Dapper Don, the impossible trials, and the burning question that still remains. Did he truly walk away from the Mafia? Or is he simply the smartest wise guy who ever lived? Before we begin this epic journey through the streets of New York and the halls of power, I want to know where you're watching from. What time is it for you right now? Write your location and time in the comments. And if you're ready for the complete, unfiltered story of Junior Gotti, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single chapter of this story. The house on 160th Avenue in Howard Beach, Queens, was purposely unremarkable. It was a modest 2-story home on a tree-lined street where children played stickball in the summer and built snow forts in the winter. To anyone just passing by, it looked like just another middle-class Italian-American family trying to make it in New York. The father worked in construction. The mother raised the kids. Nothing special to see here. Just keep walking. But appearances can be very deceiving. Inside that house lived John Joseph Gotti and his wife Victoria, along with their growing group of children. By the time John Angelo, who everyone called Junior, came along in 1964, he already had 2 older sisters, Victoria, born in 1962, and Angel, born in 1961. Later would come 2 more siblings, another brother Frank, born in 1967, and Peter, born in 1974. Victoria DiGiorgio Gotti was a woman of mixed heritage. She was half Italian from her father's side and half Russian Jewish from her mother's side. In the closed-off world of Italian-American organized crime, this made her somewhat of an outsider. But John Gotti Sr. didn't care about such old-fashioned rules. He married for love, something that would define many of his decisions throughout his life, for better and for worse. The Gotti children grew up in a household that existed in 2 different worlds. There was the public world, school, friends, Sunday dinners, Christmas at Grandma's house. And then there was the other world, the one glimpsed in hushed late-night conversations, in the parade of rough-looking men who came and went at odd hours, in the thick envelopes of cash that appeared on the kitchen table, in their father's occasional disappearances that Victoria Sr. would explain away with vague references to business trips. Young Junior absorbed it all with the watchful silence of a child who knows not to ask too many questions. The neighborhood of Howard Beach itself was a fortress of Italian-American culture. Bakeries sold fresh cannoli and sfogliatelle. Butcher shops displayed handmade sausages in the windows. The social fabric was tight-knit, insular, and governed by unspoken rules that everyone understood: respect, loyalty, family, and above all, silence. You didn't talk to outsiders about family business. You didn't talk to cops. You didn't become a rat. These weren't just cultural values. They were survival mechanisms in a world where the wrong word to the wrong person could get you killed. For the Gotti children, growing up meant learning to navigate this complex social terrain. They learned which questions to ask and which to keep to themselves. They learned to recognize the difference between their father's legitimate friends and his business associates. They learned, without ever being explicitly taught, that their family was different, special, connected to something larger and more dangerous than they could fully comprehend. And then came the tragedy that would scar the family forever. March 18, 1980. 12-year-old Frank Gotti was riding his motorized minibike near his home. It was late afternoon, the time when working men were returning home, when traffic picked up on the residential streets of Howard Beach. Frank, by all accounts a sweet and energetic kid, loved that minibike. He would ride it around the neighborhood, waving to neighbors, his dark hair whipping in the wind. John Favara lived a few houses down from the goddess. He was a furniture factory worker, a family man with children of his own. He knew the Gotti family the way neighbors do in close-knit communities, to wave to exchange pleasantries with at the corner store, to nod at across the yards on a Sunday morning. On that March afternoon, Favara was driving his car down the street, heading home after work. Witnesses would later say that Frank Gotti darted out from behind a dumpster on his minibike directly into the path of Favara's car. Favara had no time to react. The impact killed young Frank almost instantly. The investigation was swift. Police interviewed witnesses. They examined the scene. They looked at sight lines and stopping distances. Their conclusion: tragic accident. No charges filed. John Favara was devastated. But legally, he was not at fault. Frank had darted out unexpectedly. There was nothing Favara could have done. But in the world of the goddess, such legalistic distinctions meant nothing. John Gotti Jr. was in Florida when he got the call about his son's death. He returned immediately, and witnesses describe a man transformed by grief into something darker, something dangerous. Victoria Gotti Sr. was even more distraught. Her baby boy, her Frankie, was gone. Someone had to pay. The fact that it was an accident was irrelevant. Her child was dead, and John Favara was the reason why. The entire neighborhood knew what was coming. Friends urged Favara to leave, to move away, to disappear. "You don't understand," they told him. "You need to go now." But Favara, whether out of stubbornness or a naive faith in the law, stayed. He had done nothing wrong. He reasoned it was an accident. The police said so. He had his own family, his own home. Why should he run? The threats started almost immediately. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. The word murderer spray-painted across his car. Notes left on his windshield. The Gotti house was just down the street. And every day when Favara left for work, he had to drive past it, past the family whose son he had killed, even if accidentally. Then in the summer of 1980, just over 4 months after Frank's death, Victoria Gotti attacked Favara with a baseball bat in the street. She beat him as neighbors watched. Screaming curses and accusations, the police were called. No charges were filed. In Howard Beach, you didn't press charges against a grieving mother, especially not one named Gotti. John Favara finally realized the danger he was in. He put his house up for sale. He made plans to move to New Jersey, to get his family away from Howard Beach, away from the goddess, away from the suffocating atmosphere of retribution that hung over every interaction. He never made it. July 28, 1980. John Favara left work at the furniture factory and walked to his car in the parking lot. Witnesses reported seeing several men approach him. A brief scuffle. Favara was shoved into a van. The van sped away. John Favara was never seen again. His car was found abandoned. His body was never recovered. The case remains officially unsolved to this day. But everyone knew, in Howard Beach, on the streets of Queens, in the social clubs where made men gathered, everyone knew exactly what had happened to John Favara. You don't kill a Gotti child, accident or not, and walk away. The message had been sent, written in blood. You don't cross the goddess, ever, for 16-year-old Junior Gotti. His little brother's death and the subsequent disappearance of John Favara was a formative education in the unwritten rules of his world. Justice wasn't what happened in courtrooms. Justice was what happened in the streets. Loyalty to family superseded everything. The law, mercy, even common sense. And the name Gotti meant something. It meant power. It meant respect. It meant fear. It meant that when someone hurt your family, they disappeared. This was the world that shaped John Angelo Gotti, a world where violence was currency, where silence was survival, where family bonds were cemented not just by blood, but by shared complicity in actions that could never be spoken of openly. He was 16 years old, and he was learning what it meant to be a Gotti. To understand Junior, you must first understand the man who cast that long, dark shadow across his entire life. You must understand John Joseph Gotti, the Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, the last of the great American mob bosses. John Gotti Sr. was born October 27, 1940, in the South Bronx, into poverty so grinding that it's hard for modern Americans to fully comprehend. He was the fifth of 13 children born to Italian immigrants, John and Fanny Gotti, who had come to America chasing the dream and found instead overcrowded tenements, backbreaking labor, and the perpetual scramble to keep 13 mouths fed. The Bronx of the 1940s and 50s was a pressure cooker of ethnic neighborhoods where Italian, Irish, Jewish, and Puerto Rican kids all fought for the same small patches of territory, the same respect, the same opportunities, legitimate or otherwise. Young John Gotti learned early that in this world, you either fought or you got crushed. He chose to fight. He was a street kid through and through, tough, charismatic, and utterly fearless. He dropped out of Franklin K. Lane High School at 16. Not because he was stupid, he was actually quite intelligent, but because the streets offered opportunities that school never could. He fell in with a crew of young criminals in the Fulton Rockaway section of Queens. Kids who ran numbers, stole cars, hijacked trucks, and did whatever needed doing to make money. But John Gotti wasn't content to remain a street punk. He had ambition. And he had that ineffable quality that marks natural leaders. Charisma. People were drawn to him. They trusted him. They wanted to follow him. These are dangerous qualities in a young man operating outside the law. His mentor was a man named Carmine Fatico, a captain in the Gambino crime family who ran operations out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens. But Gotti's real education came from another man, Aniello Neil Delacroce, one of the most feared and respected men in the entire American Mafia. Delacroce was the underboss of the Gambino family, second only to boss Carlo Gambino himself. Where Carlo was diplomatic and strategic, Delacroce was a killer. Neil was short for Little Lamb of the Cross. But there was nothing lamb-like about Aniello Delacroce. He was a stone-cold enforcer who believed in the old ways: honor, violence, and absolute loyalty to the family. Under Delacroce's wing, John Gotti learned the business of organized crime. He learned how to run hijacking operations at JFK Airport, stealing shipments right off the trucks. He learned how to run gambling operations and loan sharking rings. He learned how to command respect through a carefully calibrated mixture of charisma and violence. He learned when to talk and when to kill. Most importantly, he learned about the hierarchy, about the structure that gave the Mafia its power. At the bottom were the associates, criminals who worked with the family but weren't formally initiated. Above them were the soldiers, made men who had been formally inducted into the family through a secret ceremony, bound by blood oath and the code of omerta silence. Above the soldiers were the caporegons, or captains, each commanding a crew of soldiers and associates. Above the captains was the underboss, the boss's second in command, and at the top sat the boss himself, the ultimate authority. The Gambino crime family was the largest and most powerful of New York's 5 families. The Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families that had dominated organized crime in New York since the 1930s. By the 1970s, the Gambinos were pulling in millions of dollars annually through their control of construction, waste management, trucking, unions, gambling, and loan sharking. John Gotti's rise through the ranks was meteoric, but it wasn't without its stumbles. In 1968, he was arrested for his role in a hijacking ring operating out of JFK Airport. He was convicted and served 3 years. When he got out, he was even more respected. In the world of the Mafia, doing time without cooperating with authorities, without ratting, was the ultimate proof of loyalty. Then came the killing of Frank Gotti in 1980 and the subsequent disappearance of John Favara. While officially unsolved, everyone knew the score. John Gotti had avenged his son. The message was clear. This was not a man to be trifled with. But the event that would make John Gotti a household name was still 5 years away, by 1985. Paul Castellano was the boss of the Gambino family. Castellano, known as Big Paul, was Carlo Gambino's brother-in-law and had taken over when Carlo died in 1976. But Castellano was a different breed of mob boss. He was more businessman than gangster, preferring to make money through white-collar schemes and labor racketeering rather than the street-level violence that had built the Mafia. He wore expensive suits and lived in a mansion in Staten Island that was derisively called the White House by the soldiers who resented his wealth. Worse, from the perspective of men like Gotti, Castellano had instituted a strict ban on drug dealing. Anyone caught dealing drugs would be killed. No questions asked. This was Castellano's attempt to keep law enforcement heat off the family. Drug cases brought mandatory sentences and gave the FBI leverage to flip members. But the ban was unpopular with the younger generation of mobsters who saw the drug trade as the future of organized crime. The real money wasn't in hijacking trucks or running numbers anymore. It was in cocaine and heroin. In 1983, Angelo Ruggiero, John Gotti's best friend, Junior's godfather and namesake, was caught on FBI wiretaps discussing heroin trafficking. John Gotti's brother Gene was also implicated. Castellano demanded to hear the tapes to assess how bad the damage was. Ruggiero refused, not just because the tapes would prove his guilt, but because they also contained disrespectful comments about Castellano himself. John Gotti knew that Castellano, backed into a corner, would eventually kill him, Gene? And Angelo, rather than risk them cooperating with the FBI to reduce their drug sentences. It was a matter of survival. Either Castellano died, or they did. But there was a problem. According to Mafia rules dating back decades, A boss could only be killed with the approval of the commission, a council of the bosses of all 5 families. It served as organized crime's Supreme Court. Getting that approval was nearly impossible, especially for killing someone as powerful as Paul Castellano. So John Gotti decided not to ask permission, working in secret. Gotti reached out to younger generation leaders in the Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families who were equally frustrated with their own boss's conservative approaches. He deliberately avoided the Genovese family, which was close to Castellano. He assembled a hit team from his own crew, and he waited for the right moment. December 16th, 1985, a cold winter evening in Manhattan. Paul Castellano and his underboss Tommy Bilotti had a dinner reservation at the Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street near Grand Central Terminal. It was rush hour. The streets were crowded with Christmas shoppers and office workers heading home. At 5:25 p.m., Castellano's black Lincoln pulled up in front of Sparks. Tommy Bilotti got out of the driver's side. As Castellano emerged from the back seat, 4 men in identical trench coats and fur hats approached. The shooting was over in seconds. 6 bullets struck Paul Castellano, including several to the head. He crumpled to the sidewalk outside one of New York's most famous restaurants. Tommy Bilotti was also shot multiple times and fell dead beside the car. The shooters melted into the crowded Manhattan streets. Nobody stopped them. Nobody tried to help. This was Mafia business. And in 1985, even in the heart of Manhattan, people knew better than to get involved. John Gotti and Sammy, the Bull Gravano, Gotti's right-hand man, watched the hit from a car parked nearby. Once it was confirmed that both Castellano and Bilotti were dead, they drove away. Within hours, John Gotti declared himself the new boss of the Gambino crime family. It was the beginning of an era unlike anything American organized crime had seen before or has seen since. What made John Gotti different from every other mob boss in American history wasn't his ruthlessness. The Mafia has never lacked for ruthless men. It wasn't his business acumen. Others had made more money. It wasn't even his willingness to kill a boss without commission approval. Audacious, but not unprecedented. What made John Gotti unique was that he was a celebrity. From 1985 until his arrest in 1990, John Gotti was the most famous criminal in America, perhaps in the world. He held court at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Manhattan's Little Italy, where he would arrive in $2,000 hand-tailored double-breasted suits, his hair perfectly coiffed, his manner imperious and confident. Tourists would gawk, locals would wave, and Gotti would smile and wave back. "This is my public," he once said when his lawyer suggested he use a back entrance to avoid the crowds. "They love me," and they did to many working-class Italian Americans and others. John Gotti represented something that had been lost in America, a sense of power and respect, of being able to stand up to authority and win. Here was a man who didn't apologize for who he was, who lived by his own code, who thumbed his nose at the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. The media ate it up. Gotti was nicknamed the Dapper Don for his expensive suits. When he beat 3 separate criminal prosecutions in the late 1980s through a combination of jury tampering, witness intimidation, and sheer legal maneuvering, the press dubbed him the Teflon Don. Charges just wouldn't stick. FBI agent Bruce Mao, who led the investigation into Gotti, would later say he was the first media don. Before him, these guys operated in the shadows. Gotti wanted to be seen. He wanted to be famous. And that ultimately became his weakness. But in those first years as boss, it seemed like John Gotti could do no wrong. His weekly meetings at the Ravenite drew dozens of made men and associates, all coming to pay their respects to the most powerful mob boss in America. He would change suits twice during court appearances, emerging from lunch recess in a completely different outfit, posing for the cameras. When supporters gathered outside the courthouse, and there were hundreds of them, he would acknowledge them with a wave and a smile, like a politician or movie star. His son, John Gotti Jr., was 21 years old when his father became boss of the Gambino family. For a young man coming of age, watching his father transform into a celebrity must have been intoxicating. Here was proof that the life could offer not just money and power, but fame and respect. His father was on the cover of magazines. The newspapers wrote about him constantly. People stopped him on the street for autographs. What Junior didn't fully understand yet, what perhaps even his father didn't fully grasp, was that all that attention had a price. Every appearance at the Ravenite was photographed by FBI surveillance teams. Every associate who came to pay respects was documented. Added to the vast conspiracy map the Bureau was building, every public display of power was another piece of evidence for the RICO case that was being methodically constructed. But that understanding would come later. In the mid-1980s, all Junior saw was his father at the peak of his power, untouchable and unstoppable. And Junior wanted that for himself, for John Gotti Sr. His son represented something precious, legacy, not just biological legacy, but the continuation of everything he had built. The Gambino family needed continuity, needed a Gotti at the helm to maintain the power structure he had seized in that brief moment of violence. Outside Sparks Steakhouse, Angelo Ruggiero was chosen as Junior's godfather, a man John Sr. trusted absolutely, though that trust would later prove misplaced when Ruggiero's loose talk on FBI wiretaps nearly destroyed everything. The choice of middle name, Angelo, was a tribute to that friendship and a signal to the entire crime family about Junior's pedigree and importance. John Sr. wanted his son to have advantages he himself had never enjoyed, rather than let Junior drift into street crime the way he had. Gotti Sr. sent his son to the New York Military Academy, a private boarding school that had educated everyone from Francis Ford Coppola to Donald Trump. The idea was to give Junior discipline, education, a veneer of legitimacy that might serve him well, whether he chose the straight life or the life of a made man. But Junior dropped out the military academy structure. The distance from the streets, the absence of the electric energy that surrounded his father, it all felt wrong. Junior was drawn to the same world that had captivated his father. The late-night meetings, the respect shown to made men when they walked into restaurants, the envelopes of cash, the power dynamics playing out in social clubs and parking lots across Queens. In 1982, at just 18 years old, Junior became a mob associate, officially. This meant he was working with the Gambino family, but wasn't yet a made member. In practice, it meant he was being groomed. He ran errands, he collected debts, he learned the business from the ground up. Serving under various captains in his father's organization, the other made men watched him carefully. Was this kid going to be like his father? A born leader with the charisma and toughness to command respect? Or was he just trading on the family name, a prince who would never be a king? Those early years were Junior's opportunity to prove himself, to show that he was more than just John Gotti's son. He needed to demonstrate loyalty, toughness, and the capacity for violence that the life required. In the Mafia, your surname might open doors, but it couldn't keep them open. You had to earn your place through action, through demonstrating that you lived by the code omerta, the vow of silence. You never cooperate with law enforcement. Never testify against another made man. Never even acknowledge that the Mafia exists. If the government catches you, you do your time in silence. The family takes care of your family while you're inside. When you get out, you're respected and rewarded for your loyalty. But if you break omerta, if you become an informant, a rat, there's only one punishment: death during these years. Junior also learned the economics of mob life. The Gambino family made money through a diversified criminal portfolio. There was the protection racket. Businesses paid regular fees to ensure nothing bad happened to them. There was loan sharking, lending money at usurious interest rates, usually to desperate people who couldn't get legitimate loans. There was illegal gambling, sports betting, numbers running, and underground casinos. There was labor racketeering, taking control of union locals, and then extracting money from contractors who wanted labor peace. But the real money was in the construction industry. New York in the 1980s was experiencing a building boom, with major projects going up across Manhattan and the outer boroughs. The Gambinos, along with the other 4 families, controlled key construction unions. If you wanted to build in New York, you paid the mob, you paid for concrete, you paid for labor, you paid for permits that mysteriously got processed faster than your competitors. You paid, and you kept your mouth shut about who you were paying. The family's take from all these operations flowed upward through the hierarchy. A soldier might collect $10,000 from various operations, but he'd kick up $4,000 to his captain. The captain would collect from multiple soldiers and kick up a share to the administration, the underboss and boss. By the time money reached the boss, it was substantial. Conservative estimates put the Gambino family's annual revenue in the 1980s at over $500 million. Junior learned all of this. He learned how to collect debts without being too rough. You want them to be able to pay you back. He learned how to identify good loan sharking candidates, desperate but employed. He learned the carefully choreographed dance of the protection racket. You never explicitly threaten. You simply note how unfortunate it would be if something happened. He learned how to read people, how to know when someone was lying, when someone was about to run, when someone was thinking about cooperating with the FBI. He was learning to be a Gambino, but there was something else Junior was learning during these years. Something he wouldn't fully articulate until much later. He was learning that this life had a cost. He saw his father constantly looking over his shoulder, constantly worried about surveillance, constantly dealing with the pressures of managing hundreds of violent criminals who all wanted more money and more respect. He saw how the stress aged his mother, how she worried every time John Sr. left the house that he might not come back. He saw how his father's brief incarcerations disrupted the family, how Christmas and birthdays were missed, how normal family life was impossible. But in those early years, the glamour and power still outweighed the costs. Junior was young, ambitious, and ready to take his place in the only world he'd ever known. His formal initiation would come soon. Christmas Eve, 1988. For most American families, this is a time of joy, of gathering around the tree to exchange gifts, of attending midnight mass, of celebrating the birth of Christ with loved ones. For John Angelo Gotti, Christmas Eve 1988 would mark a different kind of birth, his formal entry into La Cosa Nostra, our thing, the secret society that was the Gambino crime family. Junior was 24 years old. He had spent 6 years as an associate, proving his loyalty and capability. Now the time had come for his formal induction. The ceremony was supervised by Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, his father's underboss and right-hand man. Sammy was a contrast to John Sr. in almost every way. Where Gotti was flamboyant and charismatic, Gravano was quiet and methodical. Where Gotti loved the spotlight, Gravano preferred the shadows. But both men were utterly ruthless, and both understood that power came from violence and the credible threat of violence. The exact location of Junior's making ceremony has never been publicly disclosed. Such events are among the most carefully guarded secrets of the Mafia, but we know the ritual, which has remained essentially unchanged since the Mafia's formation in Sicily in the 19th century. Junior would have been brought to a room with several made members present. His sponsor, likely his father or someone his father designated, would have vouched for him, confirming that Junior understood what he was entering into and was willing to take the oath. Someone would have drawn Junior's blood, usually by pricking his trigger finger with a pin or needle. A holy card, typically of a saint, would have been placed in his hands and set on fire. As the card burned, Junior would have been required to repeat the oath. "May I burn like this saint if I betray the family?" He would have been told the rules. Always respect women and children. Never touch the wife or girlfriend of another made man. Never cooperate with law enforcement. Never kill another made man without permission from the boss. Obey your superiors absolutely. Keep the secrets of the family unto death. And then it would have been done. John Angelo Gotti was no longer just John Gotti's son. He was a made member of the Gambino crime family, a soldier bound by blood oath to the organization and its code. He was, in the language of the life, a friend of ours, a made man, a member of the exclusive brotherhood that sat at the apex of the American underworld. The timing of Junior's making is significant. His father had been boss for only 3 years at this point, and there were whispers. There were always whispers that nepotism played a role in Junior's rapid rise. Making Junior on Christmas Eve 1988, with Sammy the Bull supervising, was a way of preempting those accusations. It sent a message. Junior wasn't getting special treatment. He was going through the same ceremony as everyone else. He would be held to the same standards, but everyone knew the truth. Junior Gotti was being groomed for leadership from day one. His father intended him to eventually take over the family. To keep the Gotti dynasty in power, the making ceremony was just the first step. The rise continued. In 1990, at just 26 years old, Junior was promoted to Caporegime captain. This made him, by most accounts, one of the youngest captains in Gambino family history. A captain commands his own crew of soldiers and associates, runs his own operations, and reports directly to the family administration. It's a position of significant power and responsibility. Junior's crew operated primarily in Queens, the traditional Gotti stronghold. He inherited connections in the Carpenters Union and used those connections to run labor racketeering schemes. He also started a trucking company, Samson Trucking Company, which operated as both a legitimate business and a front for various illegal activities. The trucking company ultimately failed, as many mob-run legitimate businesses do. When you're skimming money, paying protection to various families, and using the business primarily as a front, profitability becomes secondary. In 1990, the same year he was promoted to captain, Junior married Kimberly Albanese. Kimberly was the daughter of Philip Albanese, a Gambino mobster, which meant the marriage further cemented Junior's position within the family structure. These weren't just personal relationships. They were political alliances, binding families together through marriage and a tradition that stretched back centuries in Sicily. Junior and Kimberly would eventually have 6 children together, including a son named John Gotti Jr, who would go on to become a professional a fighter. A different kind of fighting than his grandfather and father engaged in. But fighting nonetheless, the Gotti blood, it seemed, always found an outlet for its aggression. As a captain in his father's organization, Junior was responsible for generating income and managing his crew. This meant overseeing gambling operations, loan sharking, and various construction-related schemes. The money flowed upward, as it always did in the Mafia. Junior would collect from his soldiers, take his cut, and kick the rest up to the administration. In turn, the administration ensured that Junior's interests were protected, that disputes were resolved in his favor, that his authority was backed by the full weight of the Gambino family name. Life as a young captain in the early 1990s must have felt like the pinnacle of success. Junior had money, power, and respect. He had his father's protection and support. He had a growing family. He was living the life that so many young men in Howard Beach and Ozone Park dreamed of, but could never attain. But storm clouds were gathering, and they would break over the Gotti family with devastating force. The beginning of the end came from an unexpected source: loyalty. Sammy the Bull Gravano had been John Gotti Sr.'s underboss and most trusted confidant since the Castellano hit. Sammy was the muscle behind Gotti's charisma, the enforcer who made sure that the boss's orders were carried out without question. Together, Gotti and Gravano had ruled the Gambino family with an iron fist, maintaining discipline and generating enormous profits. But the FBI had been working the Gotti case relentlessly. Agent Bruce Mau and his team had a singular focus: take down the Dapper Don. They planted bugs in the Ravenite Social Club. When Gotti grew suspicious and started holding important meetings elsewhere, they planted bugs in the apartment above the club where Gotti and his top associates would retreat for private conversations. The tapes were devastating. They captured Gotti discussing murders, including the Castellano hit. They captured him discussing ongoing criminal schemes. They captured him criticizing Sammy and other members of the family. Most damaging of all, they captured Gotti's voice, his manner, his undeniable role as boss of the family. Direct evidence that this wasn't some low-level wise guy, but the head of one of America's most powerful criminal organizations. In December 1990, John Gotti Sr., Sammy Gravano, and Frank Lacasio were arrested on racketeering charges. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Even Gotti's famed legal team, which had beaten so many previous charges, knew this case was different. The tapes were too clear, the conspiracy too well documented. Gotti's lawyers tried their usual tactics, attacking the credibility of witnesses, claiming entrapment, arguing that the tapes were taken out of context. But then came the bombshell that would ensure Gotti's conviction and change organized crime forever. Facing life in prison, listening to tapes of Gotti criticizing him behind his back, and calculating his odds of acquittal, Sammy the Bull Gravano made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. He decided to cooperate with the government. He decided to break omerta. Sammy the Bull, the man who had supervised Junior's making ceremony, who had helped John Sr. kill Castellano, who had been part of the inner circle of the Gambino family for years, became a rat. His testimony was devastating. Sammy admitted to his role in 19 murders. He provided detailed testimony about the Gambino family structure and operations. Most importantly, he testified that John Gotti had ordered the Castellano hit and numerous other murders, coming from the underboss himself. This testimony was impossible to refute. The trial was a media circus. Supporters still gathered outside the courthouse, still proclaimed Gotti's innocence, still believed he would somehow beat the charges. But this time, the Teflon Don's luck had run out. April 2nd, 1992. The jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts: racketeering, murder, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced John Gotti to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Dapper Don, the most famous mob boss in American history, would never see freedom again. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, a maximum security facility where he was kept in solitary confinement for most of his remaining years. No more $2,000 suits. No more Mulberry Street. No more public appearances. Just a small cell and the slow passage of time for 28-year-old Junior Gotti. His father's conviction represented a crossroads. The man who had cast such a long shadow over his entire life was now gone. Locked away in a federal prison in Illinois, the empire his father had built was suddenly without its emperor. And Junior, ready or not, capable or not, was about to inherit the throne in the immediate aftermath of his father's conviction. Junior was named acting boss of the Gambino crime family. His father remained the official boss even from prison. John Sr. maintained his title and sought to exercise control over family operations. Uncle Peter Gotti, John Sr.'s brother, helped relay messages between the imprisoned boss and the acting boss. But the day-to-day operations, the decisions that needed to be made quickly, the disputes that needed to be resolved, all of that fell to Junior. He was 28 years old, a captain with only 2 years of experience in that role, suddenly responsible for one of the 5 families. It would have been a daunting task for anyone. For Junior, it was nearly impossible. From the beginning, Junior faced challenges his father never had. First, there was the simple matter of respect. John Sr. had earned his position through decades of work, through demonstrating his toughness and capability, through the dramatic coup of the Castellano hit. He had charisma that made people want to follow him. He had a reputation for violence that made people afraid to cross him. Junior had none of that. To many of the older made men, Junior was just a kid who got promoted because of his last name. He hadn't killed Castellano. He hadn't put in the decades of work. He was, in their eyes, a prince playing at being king second. Junior's temperament was different from his father's. Where John Sr. was decisive and commanding, Junior was more cautious and uncertain. Where John Sr. loved the spotlight and the power it brought, Junior seemed to recognize, perhaps earlier than his father did, that all that attention was ultimately destructive. Junior tried to operate quietly, avoiding the media, holding walk talks where he would discuss business while walking through parks and streets to avoid FBI surveillance devices. But the problems went deeper than style. Junior simply wasn't as good at the job as his father had been. He was, by multiple accounts from cooperating witnesses, a poor negotiator compared to John Sr. when disputes arose with other families, and they arose constantly. Junior often came out on the losing end. The Genovese family, the largest and most powerful of the 5 families, refused to deal with him at all, considering him unworthy of his position. His own men didn't respect him. Multiple cooperating witnesses would later testify that they considered Junior incompetent as a boss. In the Mafia, where respect is everything, this was a death sentence for Junior's leadership. If your own soldiers don't respect you, they won't follow your orders. If other families don't respect you, they'll take advantage of you in every negotiation. And if the old-timers don't respect you, they'll work to undermine you and install someone else. The Gambino family under Junior's leadership was fracturing. Different factions were pursuing their own agendas. The tight discipline that John Sr. had maintained was eroding. Younger members were dealing drugs despite the supposed family ban. Made men were refusing to kick up their proper share of earnings. Associates were conducting unauthorized operations. And then there were the threats to Junior's life itself. In 1995, just 3 years into Junior's tenure as acting boss, FBI sources reported an assassination plot against him. The conspirators were Charles Carneglia, a Gambino soldier known for his violence and brutality, and John Elite, a close associate who had grown up with Junior in Queens. The plot never materialized, whether because the FBI disrupted it or because the conspirators got cold feet is unclear. But the existence of the plot revealed a stark truth. Junior couldn't even trust his own family's members. In the Mafia, assassination plots are usually about money or respect, and both were in short supply under Junior's leadership. Meanwhile, the FBI was closing in. The Bureau had learned from their success with John Sr. They knew that the key to taking down mob families was to flip members, to break the code of omerta and get insiders to testify. And the new RICO laws gave them powerful leverage to do exactly that. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, allowed prosecutors to charge individuals not just with specific crimes, but with being part of a criminal enterprise. Under RICO, if you were a made member of a mafia family and that family committed crimes, you could be held responsible for those crimes, even if you didn't personally commit them. The sentences were severe, often life in prison. Faced with such sentences, many mobsters made the calculation that loyalty wasn't worth dying in prison for. The old code was dying. Men who would have once accepted their fate and done their time in silence were now cutting deals, testifying, entering witness protection. Each flip provided prosecutors with more evidence, which they could use to pressure more mobsters to flip, which led to more evidence. It was a self-reinforcing cycle that was destroying La Cosa Nostra from within. In 1997, the FBI raided Junior's home in Oyster Bay Cove, Long Island. The house itself was a sign of Junior's rising status. Oyster Bay Cove was an affluent community, far removed from the working-class streets of Howard Beach, where Junior had grown up. But the raid brought all those streets back. In the basement, agents discovered a typed list of made members in the Gambino family, a direct violation of Mafia rules that such information should never be written down. They found $348,700 in cash, bundled and hidden. They found documentation of Junior's wedding, including a guest list with dollar amounts next to names, records of the traditional cash gifts that mobsters give at weddings. The total gifts exceeded $350,000, a testament to Junior's position and the number of people who owed him respect or feared him enough to pay it. They also found 2 handguns. The evidence was mounting. Junior knew it. The FBI knew it. The question was no longer if Junior would be indicted, but when. And underneath all of this external pressure, Junior was reaching an internal breaking point. He was watching what the life had done to his father, stuck in a maximum security prison, aging rapidly, increasingly isolated. He was feeling the constant pressure of leadership, the responsibility for hundreds of criminals, the knowledge that any mistake could result in death or imprisonment. He was seeing his own children growing up, and he was starting to ask himself the question that would define the rest of his life. Was this really the life he wanted? Was this worth it? By the late 1990s, Junior was starting to realize that the answer was no. 1999 was the year everything changed for John Angelo Gotti. He was 35 years old, had been acting boss of the Gambino family for 7 years, and was facing the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. Just like his father, the indictment came down like a hammer. racketeering charges, conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, bribery, and various other counts that could add up to a life sentence. The government had been building its case for years, collecting evidence from wiretaps, surveillance, and most damaging of all, cooperating witnesses, former associates, and even made men who had decided that Omerta was worth less than freedom. Junior looked at his options. He could fight the charges, hire expensive lawyers, go to trial, and hope for an acquittal. That's what his father had done for years, and it had worked until it didn't. The government was more sophisticated now. They understood how to prosecute RICO cases. They had better technology, better investigators, and most importantly, a steady stream of mobsters willing to testify against their former colleagues. Or Junior could do something that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier, something that would disappoint his father but might save his own life. He could plead guilty and cooperate, not fully cooperate, not become a rat testifying against others, but cooperate enough to get a reduced sentence and then walk away from the life entirely. Junior chose the second option, but he tried to walk a razor's edge, pleading guilty without becoming an informant. He pleaded guilty to racketeering charges, acknowledging his role in the Gambino family's criminal operations. In exchange, he received a sentence of 77 months, 6 years and 5 months in federal prison. For a mob boss, this was a remarkably light sentence. It suggested that while Junior had admitted to crimes, he hadn't provided testimony that resulted in additional prosecutions. But the plea deal came with something more significant than just a reduced sentence. It came with Junior's claim that he was done with the life. He told his lawyers, and through them the court, that he had told his father, "Dad, your life is not my life. I can't do this anymore." According to Junior, his father gave him permission to leave. This was crucial. You don't just walk away from the Mafia. The traditional rule is once you're in for life. The only ways out are death or witness protection after cooperating with the government. But if the boss gives you permission to leave, if you retire with the family's blessing, then theoretically you can walk away. Junior claimed that in 1998-1999, he formally withdrew from the Gambino family and declared himself a civilian. He was no longer a made man. He was no longer acting boss. He was out. The government didn't believe him, and they would spend the next decade trying to prove it. Junior went to prison in 1999 to serve his 77-month sentence. He thought he was done with the legal system, that he would serve his time, get out, and start a new life as a legitimate citizen. He was wrong. In 2004, while still in prison, Junior was hit with a new indictment, 11 counts of racketeering, including an alleged plot to kidnap Curtis Sleva. Curtis Sleva was the founder of the Guardian Angels, a volunteer organization that patrolled New York City streets to deter crime. But Sleva was also a radio talk show host on WABC, and throughout the early 1990s, he had used his platform to repeatedly criticize John Gotti Jr., calling him public enemy number one and making him a regular target of on-air commentary. According to the government's theory, Junior had ordered an attack on Sleva in June 1992 in retaliation for those criticisms. The attack was botched. Sleva survived after being shot, but the government alleged that Junior was behind it. The new indictment also included charges of securities fraud, extortion, and loan sharking. All of these crimes allegedly occurred during Junior's time as acting boss. Before his supposed retirement from the life, Junior was released from prison in 2005 after serving his sentence for the original racketeering charges. But instead of going home to his family, he immediately faced trial on these new charges. His defense was simple. I left the life in 1999. These charges relate to events from the early 1990s, from when I was still active, but I'm not that person anymore. I've left. His attorney, Jeffrey Lichtman, admitted that Jr. had been a mobster. There was no point in denying it. Jr. had already pleaded guilty to racketeering. But Lichtman argued that Jr. had genuinely walked away, that he had made a clean break, and that the government was prosecuting him not because of evidence of recent crimes, but because of his last name. The trial featured multiple cooperating witnesses, former Gambino associates like Michael DeLeonardo and Joseph D'Angelo, who testified about Jr.'s role in various criminal schemes during the 1990s. They painted a picture of Jr. as an active, hands-on leader of the family, ordering beatings, approving murders, and running criminal operations. But the prosecution had a problem: credibility. These weren't upstanding citizens testifying against Jr. These were criminals, many of whom had committed horrific acts themselves and were now testifying in exchange for reduced sentences or admission into witness protection. The defense hammered away at their credibility, pointing out inconsistencies in their testimony and their obvious motivations to lie. The jury deliberated for days. The government had presented what they thought was a strong case. They had witnesses, they had evidence, they had motive, but the jury couldn't agree. They were deadlocked. The judge declared a mistrial. The government immediately announced they would retry the case. They had invested too much in taking down Jr. Gotti to give up after one mistrial. The second trial in 2005 played out much the same way. Same charges, same witnesses, same defense strategy, same result. Deadlocked jury, mistrial declared. Still, the government persisted. They had unlimited resources, and they were determined to get a conviction. The third trial came in 2006. By now, the pattern was becoming clear. Prosecutors would present their case, relying heavily on cooperating witnesses. The defense would attack those witnesses' credibility and argue that Jr. had left the life. The jury would deliberate, struggle with the conflicting evidence and questionable witness credibility, and ultimately be unable to reach a unanimous verdict. Mistrial number 3. After 3 mistrials on the same charges, federal prosecutors made a rare decision. They declined to pursue a 4th trial on the Curtis Leva charges. It was a tacit admission that they couldn't win a conviction on this particular case. No matter how many times they tried, John Angelo Gotti had earned his nickname, the Teflon Son. Just like his father, charges against him weren't sticking. But the government was far from done with him. August 5, 2008, Jr. was at his home in Oyster Bay Cove, likely thinking that the worst was behind him. 3 mistrials on this Leva case. No new charges in years. Maybe, he might have thought, the government had finally given up. Then a dozen federal agents swarmed his property. This time, the charges were even more serious. A new indictment originating from Florida charged Jr. with racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder in connection with 3 specific killings. George Grosso, killed in December 1988 in Queens. Louis DeBono, killed in October 1990. Shot 7 times in a World Trade Center parking garage. Bruce John Gotti, killed in November 1991 in Queens. The indictment also charged Jr. with running a drug trafficking ring that distributed at least 5 kilograms of cocaine across New York, New Jersey, and Florida. These were death penalty eligible crimes. The government had the option of seeking capital punishment. They ultimately chose not to, likely because they knew that getting a death penalty conviction would be even harder than getting a regular conviction. But the option's existence showed how seriously they were taking these charges. The key government witness was John Elite, the same man who had been part of the alleged assassination plot against Jr. back in 1995. Elite had grown up with Jr. in Queens, had been part of Jr.'s crew, and had been present during many of the alleged criminal activities. Now he was a cooperating witness, willing to testify about everything he'd seen and participated in. The trial was moved from Florida to Manhattan Federal Court, ensuring maximum media attention. This would be the biggest Gotti trial since John Sr.'s conviction in 1992, September 2009. 45-year-old John Angelo Gotti walked into Manhattan Federal Court to face what everyone knew would be the trial of his life. 3 mistrials hadn't deterred the government. If anything, it had made them more determined. This time they were going for murder charges. This time they thought they had their strongest case yet, Assistant U.S. Attorney Ellie Honig's opening statement was devastating in its bluntness. He has threatened, extorted, robbed, beaten, kidnapped, stabbed, shot, and killed. Killed with his own hands, and ordered others to kill for him. This man is a criminal who has lived the Mafia life and profited from it for decades. The prosecution's case was built primarily on the testimony of John Elite. Elite took the stand and testified that Jr. was responsible for at least 8 murders. He provided detailed accounts of beatings, drug deals, and violent crimes stretching back to the 1980s. He painted Jr. not as a reluctant participant in mob life, but as an enthusiastic and violent enforcer who had killed with his own hands. The courtroom drama was intense at one point. Jr. allegedly mouthed the words, "I'll kill you," to Elite while he was testifying. The 2 former friends engaged in a shouting match across the courtroom, with years of betrayal and animosity boiling over in front of the jury, the judge, and the assembled media. Jr.'s sister Victoria Gotti, who had become a reality TV personality and author, publicly called Elite a pathological liar, a rat caught in a proverbial trap, the Gotti family. Even with John Sr. dead since 2002, still closed ranks when one of their own was under attack. Defense attorney Charles Carnesi presented a very different picture. In his opening statement, he acknowledged Jr.'s past, but emphasized his transformation. He saw his father die in prison away from his family. By 1999, he came face to face with hard reality. He said, "I'm out. I want no part of this." The defense strategy was to admit what couldn't be denied. Yes, Jr. had been a mobster, while arguing that he had genuinely left that life behind a decade earlier. All of the murders and crimes Elite was testifying about occurred during Jr.'s time as an active member of the family. But since 1999, there was no evidence of Jr. engaging in criminal activity. The defense also hammered away at Elite's credibility. They pointed out that Elite himself was an admitted murderer, drug dealer, and violent criminal. They noted that he was testifying in exchange for a reduced sentence and admission into witness protection. They highlighted inconsistencies in his testimony and his obvious motivation to embellish his stories to please prosecutors. The problem for the prosecution was that Elite was frankly not a credible witness. He had committed horrific crimes. He had every reason to lie. And his testimony was uncorroborated for many of the most serious allegations. The jury was being asked to convict Jr. of murder based largely on the word of a man who was, by his own admission, a career criminal and killer. The jury deliberated for 11 days, an unusually long time that suggested deep disagreement among the jurors. The prosecutors waited nervously. The defense team waited hopefully. Junior waited with the resigned patience of someone who had been through this before. December 1st, 2009. The jury sent a note to Judge Castel. We cannot reach a unanimous decision on any count. Mistrial number 4. The impossible had happened again. January 2010. The United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, one of the most prestigious and powerful prosecutorial offices in the country, held a press conference to make a stunning announcement. They would no longer seek to prosecute John Angelo Gotti. After 15 assistant U.S. attorneys had worked on his cases, after more than 100 cooperating witnesses had testified, after 4 full trials, after spending millions of taxpayer dollars, after nearly a decade of relentless prosecution, they were giving up. Junior Gotti had already served 6 years in prison for his 1999 guilty plea, but on the murder charges, on the drug trafficking charges, on all the subsequent indictments, he had never been convicted. 4 juries had been unable to reach unanimous verdicts. The government's statement was carefully worded. They didn't say Junior was innocent. They didn't apologize for the prosecutions. They simply stated that after 4 trials and 4 mistrials, they had decided not to pursue further prosecution. Reading between the lines, the message was clear. They couldn't win. No matter how many witnesses they called, no matter how much evidence they presented, they couldn't convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt that Junior was guilty of the charges against him. On December 1st, 2009, John Angelo Gotti walked out of court a free man for the first time in a decade. He returned to his home in Oyster Bay Cove. He was reunited with his wife Kimberly and their 6 children. He was free to live his life without the constant threat of prison hanging over him. The Teflon son had done what seemed impossible. He had survived 4 trials. He had beaten the United States government. He had walked away from a life sentence in federal prison. But the question remained, had he really walked away from the life itself? Junior's release came 7 years after his father's death. John Gotti Sr. had died on June 10, 2002. In a federal medical prison in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old. The cause was throat cancer, though some speculated that decades of chain smoking had contributed to the disease. John Sr. died as he had lived his final decade, in prison, away from his family, unable to attend his children's weddings or hold his grandchildren. He died still maintaining his identity as the boss of the Gambino family, still trying to exercise control over the organization from behind bars, still refusing to show any regret or remorse for the life he had lived. Junior never got to have a proper goodbye with his father. Federal prison regulations and his own legal troubles meant that their final meetings were through prison glass, their conversations monitored, their relationship reduced to brief visits and monitored phone calls. Whatever final words passed between them, whatever wisdom or regrets the father shared with the son, remains private. But Junior had the benefit of learning from his father's fate. He saw how the spotlight that John Sr. had courted so aggressively ultimately destroyed him. The media attention, the public persona of the Dapper Don, all of it gave the FBI the motivation and the political cover to pursue John Sr. relentlessly until they brought him down. And once down, the system showed no mercy. Life without parole, maximum security, solitary confinement, death far from family. Uncle Peter Gotti had briefly taken over as boss of the Gambino family in 2002 after John Sr.'s death. But Peter's reign lasted only about a year before he was convicted on racketeering charges in 2003. He was sentenced to 25 years and died in federal prison in February 2021 at age 81. The Gotti family's grip on the Gambino organization had been broken. The empire that John Sr. built through the Castellano, assassination, and maintained through violence and charisma had crumbled. The family still existed. The Gambino crime family remains one of the 5 families to this day, but it was a shadow of its former self, fractured by prosecutions, weakened by defections, and diminished by the changed landscape of American organized crime. For Junior, returning to his family in Oyster Bay Cove in 2009, the question wasn't whether he could reclaim his position as boss. That ship had sailed. The question was whether he could build a legitimate life, whether he could truly be the civilian he claimed to have become a decade earlier. During his time in prison, Junior had done something unusual for a mob boss. He had educated himself. He earned his GED, his high school equivalency diploma, and then took college courses to become a paralegal. He studied law, learning the same legal strategies and techniques that his own lawyers had used in his defense. This education served multiple purposes. It allowed Junior to assist his own attorneys in building his defense, understanding the legal arguments and helping to identify weaknesses in the prosecution's case. It also let him help other inmates with their legal issues, earning him respect inside prison through his knowledge rather than his name or reputation for violence. But most importantly, it gave Junior a new identity. He wasn't just John Gotti's son anymore. He wasn't just a former mob boss. He was someone who had used his time in prison productively, who had transformed himself, who had a skill set that could be used legitimately. After his release, Junior focused on several projects. Real estate. He invested in property, using the money he had accumulated during his years in the life, and likely some family money to build a legitimate income stream. Writing. In 2015, Junior published a book titled Shadow of My Father with investigative reporter Peter Lance. The book was Junior's attempt to tell his side of the story, to explain his life and his decisions in his own words. It was part memoir, part legal argument, part criticism of the prosecutorial system that had pursued him so relentlessly. In the book, Junior chronicles his father's rise and fall. He tells the story of his own initiation into the mob and his time as acting boss. He details what he characterizes as prosecutorial misconduct, the aggressive tactics used by federal prosecutors to try to flip witnesses, the forum shopping that moved his case from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, the parade of cooperating witnesses who had committed far worse crimes than Junior but walked free in exchange for their testimony. Junior's central argument in the book is that the government's obsession with taking down anyone named Gotti led to a prosecution. It was more about the family name than about justice. He points out that many of the witnesses who testified against him, men who admitted to multiple murders, received light sentences or no prison time at all. While he faced life in prison for crimes he says he didn't commit. The book was titled The King of the Volcano in its original conception. Referencing a Sicilian proverb about power and its inevitable consequences, the final title, Shadow of My Father, captured the essence of Junior's entire life. Always living in the long shadow cast by John Gotti Sr., defined by that relationship even as he tried to escape it, film and television. Junior became involved in several documentary productions about organized crime and his family. These included Witsec Mafia, about witness protection and cooperating witnesses, and Betrayal, John Gotti and the Fall of La Cosa Nostra. He also worked on screenplays. Attempting to shape the narrative of his family's story for film, this was a canny move. If Hollywood was going to tell the Gotti story, and they inevitably would, given the dramatic arc of his father's life, Junior wanted to have input into how that story was told. Better to be inside the process, shaping the narrative, than to be a passive subject of someone else's interpretation. Business ventures. Beyond real estate, Jr. was involved in various legitimate business ventures. Though the details of many remain private, by 2025, his estimated net worth is in the millions from legitimate ventures. Money from both his criminal past and his legitimate present. But the past has a way of catching up with you, especially when your past involves organized crime. November 2013, Jr. was at a restaurant in Syosset, New York, when a fight broke out. Being John Gotti's son, being a former mob boss himself, Jr. intervened to break up the fight. In the scuffle, he was stabbed. He survived the attack. But the incident raised obvious questions. Was this a random act of violence, or was it targeted? Did someone from his mob past have a score to settle? Was it a message from whatever remained of the Gambino family? Or was it simply bad luck, wrong place, wrong time? Jr. and law enforcement never provided clear answers. The official story was that Jr. was just trying to break up a fight and got caught in the violence. But in the world where Jr. had spent most of his adult life, coincidences were rare and violence was usually meaningful. The stabbing was a reminder. You can leave the Mafia, but the Mafia never completely leaves you. The connections, the enemies, the lingering resentments, they don't disappear just because you declare yourself a civilian. Jr.'s son, John Gotti Jr, became a professional mixed martial arts fighter. He competed under his famous surname, using the Gotti name in his fighting career, rather than running from it. On the surface, this might seem like breaking the family cycle. Instead of becoming a mobster like his grandfather and father, John III channeled his aggression into a legitimate, legal form of combat. MMA fighting is regulated, supervised, and most importantly, legal. When John III enters the cage, he's fighting within the bounds of law and sport, not breaking knees for loan payments or settling beefs with baseball bats. But there's something almost poetic about a Gotti making his living through fighting. The family has always been about toughness, about respect earned through physical dominance, about never backing down. John III's career in MMA captures that essential Gotti identity while channeling it into a form that won't land him in federal prison. Jr.'s other children have remained largely out of the public eye, which is perhaps exactly what Jr. wanted for them. He has been vocal about his desire for his kids to have normal lives, to have legitimate careers, to not follow him or his father down the path of organized crime. Whether he has succeeded in breaking that cycle remains to be seen. The Gotti name will always carry weight, will always be associated with organized crime, will always draw attention. But if Jr.'s children can build successful, legitimate lives despite that name, or perhaps even because of the opportunities that name provides, then perhaps Jr.'s decision to leave the life will have been worth it. Despite everything, despite 4 trials, despite 6 years in prison, despite a decade of intense government scrutiny, John Angelo Gotti was never convicted of murder. This is a remarkable fact in the world of mob bosses and acting bosses. Murder is often part of the job description. Paul Castellano was killed by John Sr.'s order, Louis Di Bono, George Grosso, Bruce John Gotterup, all allegedly killed on Jr.'s orders. Yet Jr. was never convicted of any of these killings. This raises fundamental questions that different people answer differently. Question 1. Did Jr. actually leave the life in 1999, as he claims? The prosecution's answer: no. He remained involved in criminal activities, but became more careful about how he conducted business. The evidence simply wasn't strong enough to convict him. Jr.'s answer: yes, he made a clean break. walked away with his father's blessing, and has lived as a legitimate citizen since. The jury's answer, 4 times. We cannot reach a unanimous decision. Question 2. Was the government right to pursue him so aggressively? The prosecution's answer, absolutely. Junior was a mob boss responsible for terrible crimes. The fact that juries couldn't reach verdicts doesn't mean he was innocent. It means the legal system has high standards for conviction. Junior's answer, no, this was a vendetta based on his last name. The government used questionable witnesses and aggressive tactics because they wanted a Gotti conviction at any cost. Question 3. Can someone truly leave the Mafia? Traditionally, the answer was no. Once made, always made. The only ways out were death or cooperating with the government, which often led to death anyway. But Junior's case suggests a different possibility. If you're the boss's son, if you have enough political capital within the family, if you're willing to walk away from power and money and respect, maybe you can leave. Maybe the rules aren't quite as absolute as everyone believes. Or maybe Junior never really left. Maybe he just got better at hiding his continued involvement. Maybe he operated through intermediaries. Maybe he stayed connected while maintaining plausible deniability. The truth, as with most things in life, is probably complicated and somewhere in between the extremes. The full context of John Sr.'s rise. To fully understand Junior's story, we must circle back to his father. Because everything Junior experienced, everything he struggled with, everything he tried to escape, it all flows from the life and decisions of John Gotti Sr. John Sr.'s rise from the poverty of the South Bronx to the pinnacle of American organized crime is a quintessentially American story. Albeit a dark version of it, he was the embodiment of ambition and ruthlessness, charisma and violence in equal measure. As a young man in the 1960s and 70s, John Gotti ran with a crew that specialized in hijacking trucks at JFK Airport. He worked alongside his brother Gene and his best friend Angelo Ruggiero, stealing everything from clothing to electronics to cigarettes. The operation was lucrative and relatively low risk. Hit the trucks before they left the airport, sell the goods through fences, and pocket the cash. But John had aspirations beyond truck hijacking. Under the mentorship of Aniello Delacroce, he learned the full scope of mob operations. He learned about the construction rackets where the real money was made. He learned about political corruption, about paying off cops and judges, about the difference between legitimate authority and the kind of power that comes from the barrel of a gun. Most importantly, he learned about respect. In the Mafia, respect is more than just a feeling. It's currency. Respect means other families won't encroach on your territory. Respect means your soldiers follow your orders without question. Respect means when you walk into a room, conversations stop and everyone turns to acknowledge you. John Gotti built his respect through a careful combination of generosity and violence. He was known for his loyalty to his crew. If you worked for John Gotti and you got arrested, your family was taken care of while you did your time. But he was also known for his capacity for extreme violence against anyone who disrespected him or threatened his operation. The nicknames that attached to him in his early years, Black John, Crazy Horse, reflected his reputation for unpredictable violence. You didn't want to be on John Gotti's bad side. December 16, 1985, remains one of the most significant dates in American organized crime history. The assassination of Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse wasn't just a murder. It was a revolution that changed the Mafia forever. Paul Castellano represented the old guard. He was cautious, business-minded, more comfortable in boardrooms than on street corners. He saw the Mafia's future in labor racketeering, in infiltrating legitimate businesses, in white-collar crime that generated steady income without the heat that came from murders and drug dealing. But the younger generation, led by John Gotti, saw things differently. They wanted the action, the excitement, the quick scores that came from more aggressive operations. They resented Castellano's mansion in Staten Island, his detachment from the day-to-day struggles of soldiers on the street, his willingness to let the Genovese family take the lead on major decisions. The drug issue brought things to a head. Castellano's ban on drug dealing was sound policy from a strategic standpoint. Drug cases brought long sentences and motivated defendants to flip, but it was deeply unpopular, with soldiers who saw their competitors in other families making fortunes from cocaine and heroin. When Angelo Ruggiero was caught on tape discussing heroin deals, Castellano demanded to hear the tapes. Ruggiero refused, knowing the tapes contained not just evidence of drug dealing, but also disrespectful comments about the boss. This created an impossible situation. Castellano couldn't let such defiance stand. He would have to kill Ruggiero, which meant he would probably have to kill Gene Gotti and John Gotti too, since they would obviously retaliate for their friend and brother's murder. John Gotti, recognizing that he was facing death, decided to strike first, but he knew he couldn't just kill Castellano through conventional channels. If he asked the commission for permission, they would likely side with Castellano. He was a boss after all, and the commission existed largely to protect bosses from exactly this kind of internal threat. So Gotti went around the commission. He reached out to younger leaders in other families who were equally frustrated with their own boss's conservative approaches. He built a coalition not of families, but of a generation. The hit on Castellano was, in a sense, a generational revolt against the old guard. The execution was brazen. Rush hour in Midtown Manhattan, a busy restaurant. Castellano shot 6 times, including multiple shots to the head. His body left on the sidewalk as his killers disappeared into the crowd. And John Gotti, observing from a nearby car, making sure the job was done right. The message was unmistakable. John Gotti was now the boss, and he had taken that position by force. Anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with him directly. Nobody did, from 1985 to 1992. John Gotti was the undisputed king of New York's underworld and one of the most famous criminals in America. He beat case after case, earning the Teflon Don nickname as charges failed to stick. He cultivated a public persona, wearing $2,000 suits and waving to supporters outside courthouses. He was on magazine covers. He was profiled in newspapers. He was incredibly popular. This popularity was complex to Italian Americans, especially working-class Italian Americans in New York. Gotti represented a certain kind of pride. Here was someone who looked like them, talked like them, came from the same neighborhoods they did, and he was standing up to authority, refusing to be pushed around, demanding respect. Never mind that he was a criminal. He was their criminal to a broader public. Gotti was fascinating in the way that all outlaws are fascinating. He was doing things that most people couldn't imagine doing. He was living by his own rules. In an America that was becoming increasingly corporate and conformist in the 1980s, there was something almost romantic about John Gotti's refusal to bend. But this public persona, this celebrity status, was ultimately what destroyed him. The FBI couldn't ignore such a high-profile target. Politicians couldn't be seen as soft when someone was so openly flouting the law. Prosecutors could make their careers by taking down the Dapper Don. The old-school mob bosses had understood something that Gotti didn't fully appreciate. Invisibility is protection. Carlo Gambino lived in a modest house in Brooklyn and rarely appeared in public. He died peacefully in his bed at age 74, never having spent significant time in prison. That's the model for a successful mob boss. Make money quietly, avoid attention, and die of old age. John Gotti chose the opposite path, and it killed him when Sammy Gravano flipped. He didn't just provide testimony. He provided a roadmap of the Gambino family's operations. He described the hierarchy, the rules, the ceremonies, the murders. He admitted his own role in 19 killings, and most devastatingly, he confirmed that John Gotti had ordered the Castellano hit and numerous other murders. Coming from the underboss himself, this testimony was ironclad. The defense couldn't claim Sammy was lying because he had no knowledge of these events. He was there for all of them. They couldn't claim he was just a low-level criminal trying to reduce his sentence. He was the number 2 man in the organization. The tapes from the Ravenite Social Club apartment sealed Gotti's fate. Here was his voice discussing criminal operations, ordering hits, managing the family. The charisma that had served him so well in public was captured on tape. But in a context that proved his criminal leadership, the jury convicted him on all counts. Life without parole. John Gotti was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, a maximum security facility designed for the most dangerous criminals in the federal system. He was kept in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. No more suits, no more public appearances. No more supporters cheering outside courthouses, just a cell and time. And the slow realization that he would never see freedom again. From Marion, Gotti tried to maintain control of the Gambino family. He designated Jr. as acting boss, sending messages through Peter Gotti and through lawyers during visits. But running a criminal organization from solitary confinement is nearly impossible. Communications were monitored, visits were limited. The family's operations continued, but increasingly without Gotti's direct input. In 1998, Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer. He received treatment and the cancer went into remission. But in 2000, it returned, more aggressive this time. He was transferred to the United States Medical Center for federal prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, where he could receive specialized treatment. But by 2002, it was clear that the cancer was winning. John Gotti, the Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, the last great American mob boss, was dying. On June 10, 2002, he passed away. He was 61 years old. He had spent the last 10 years of his life in prison. He never held his grandchildren. He never attended his children's weddings except Junior's, which occurred before his imprisonment. He never saw another Christmas at home, another Sunday dinner with the family, another normal day of freedom. This was the price of being boss. This was what Junior had watched his father pay. And this was what ultimately convinced Junior to walk away from the life. If he stayed in, if he remained in the Mafia, he was destined to end up exactly like his father, dead or in prison. Probably both. Anthony Gaspard Casso, the underboss of the Lucchese crime family, later said something significant about John Gotti and the Castellano hit. What John Gotti did was the beginning of the end of La Cosa Nostra. Casso's point was that, by killing a boss without commission approval, Gotti had violated one of the fundamental rules that had kept the Mafia stable for decades. The commission existed to prevent exactly this kind of internal warfare. If every ambitious captain could kill his boss whenever he disagreed with policy, the Mafia would tear itself apart. But Gotti got away with it, largely because he was charismatic and successful enough that no one wanted to challenge him immediately after the hit. This set a precedent. If the rules could be broken once, and the person who broke them could prosper, then the rules weren't really rules. They were suggestions. Beyond that, Gotti's celebrity status brought unprecedented law enforcement attention to all 5 families. The FBI's success in taking down Gotti emboldened them to pursue RICO cases against all the families. The techniques they used, electronic surveillance, turning underbosses into witnesses, became the template for dismantling organized crime. By the early 2000s, all of the 5 families had been severely weakened. The Bonanno family had been so thoroughly infiltrated that it was temporarily thrown off the commission. The Colombo family had been torn apart by internal wars. The Lucchese family had been devastated by prosecutions. The Genovese family survived best because it had maintained the old code of invisibility. But even they were diminished, and the Gambino family, once the largest and most powerful, was a shadow of its former self. John Sr. dead, Peter Gotti in prison, Jr. out of the life, allegedly. The family's leadership in chaos, its operations disrupted, its reputation damaged. John Gotti had achieved fame and power on a scale that no mob boss before him had reached. But in doing so, he had helped destroy the very institution that gave him that power. Junior understood this. He had lived through it. He had watched his father's glory and his father's fall, and he had decided that the glory wasn't worth the fall. What is it actually like to be a made man in the Mafia? The movies make it look glamorous, expensive clothes, beautiful women, respect, power, money. But the reality is more complex and considerably darker. When Junior Gotti was inducted on Christmas Eve 1988, he was entering into a blood oath that traditionally lasted until death. The ceremony itself is designed to be psychologically binding. You prick your finger and draw blood, a physical sacrifice and a reminder that you're willing to shed blood for the family. You burn a holy card while swearing an oath, a symbolic death and rebirth as a made member. You hear the rules, the code, the expectations, and you swear to uphold them all. The rules were clear on paper. Absolute omerta. Obedience, controlled violence, but day-to-day reality was far messier, demanding constant compromise in a world where disobedience meant death. And then there's the violence. The movies show mob hits as clean, quick affairs. The reality is often messier and more brutal. People don't die instantly like they do in films. They beg, they plead, they try to negotiate. Sometimes they even fight back, and someone has to pull that trigger, or thrust that knife, or swing that bat. Someone has to look another human being in the eyes and end their life. Junior participated in this world for over a decade. During his time as a made man and later as acting boss, people were beaten, extorted, and, according to government allegations, killed. Whether Junior personally committed these acts or merely ordered them, he was part of a system built on violence. The money from these operations flowed upward through the organization. Earnings flowed strictly upward. Soldiers kicked up to captains. Captains to the administration. The boss took the largest share, but with it came the constant pressure of managing violent men and endless disputes. As acting boss, Junior wasn't just collecting money. He was settling disputes between captains. He was negotiating with other families over territorial issues. He was deciding who got promoted, who got demoted, who got killed. He was managing relationships with corrupt cops, judges, and politicians. He was dealing with constant FBI surveillance. He was worrying about informants in his own organization. It was, in its own way, a job, a criminal job with a high mortality rate and a near-certain eventual imprisonment. But a job nonetheless. By the late 1990s, Junior faced a choice that most made men never get to make. Usually, The Mafia offers only two exits: death or witness protection after cooperating. But Junior had leverage that most mobsters don't have: his father's blessing. John Sr., rotting in a federal prison, watching his own son face the same fate, apparently gave Junior permission to leave. This is according to Junior's own account, and we can't verify it independently since John Sr. is dead. But if true, it represents a remarkable moment, a mob boss essentially releasing his heir from the blood oath. Why would John Sr. do this? Perhaps he realized that the life had destroyed him and didn't want to see Junior destroyed too. Perhaps he understood that the Mafia as he knew it was dying, that the old code was eroding, that his son would be better off building a legitimate life. Perhaps he simply loved his son more than he loved the organization. Or perhaps Junior is lying, and he never really left at all. Perhaps the whole "I'm out" claim is an elaborate cover story to give him legal cover while he continues to pull strings behind the scenes. The government certainly believed the latter. Why else would they prosecute him 4 times? Why else would they invest so many resources into trying to prove he was still active? But 4 juries couldn't be convinced. That's significant. Juries are shown evidence and testimony that the public never sees. They're instructed on the law and what the government must prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And 4 times, 12 ordinary citizens looked at the evidence and said, "We're not convinced. Maybe Junior really did walk away. Maybe the government's case was built on the shaky testimony of cooperating witnesses with obvious credibility problems. Maybe the truth is that Junior participated in crimes when he was active, but successfully withdrew in 1999, and the government simply refused to believe it because they couldn't imagine a Gotti walking away. Or maybe Junior is just very, very good at avoiding conviction while remaining connected to organized crime. The answer probably lies somewhere in between these extremes. Human beings are complicated. Motivations are mixed. It's possible that Junior genuinely wanted to leave, made efforts to leave, but couldn't completely sever all ties. It's possible he maintains friendships with people still in the life, takes their calls when they reach out, maybe even offers advice without participating in active criminal operations. Is that being out legally? Probably yes. In the spirit of Omerta and the Mafia Code? That's a harder question. The prosecution of Junior Gotti raises uncomfortable questions about the American justice system and the allocation of prosecutorial resources. 4 trials, 15 assistant U.S. attorneys, more than 100 cooperating witnesses, millions of dollars in investigation and prosecution costs, all to convict one man. Many of the witnesses who testified against Junior were themselves violent criminals. John Elite, a star witness in the 4th trial, admitted to multiple murders. Other witnesses had similar or worse criminal histories. These men were given reduced sentences, monetary payments, and admission into witness protection in exchange for their testimony. The moral calculus here is troubling. The government freed or gave lenient sentences to men who committed numerous murders, while aggressively prosecuting Junior for crimes he may or may not have committed, based largely on the testimony of those same murderers. Is that justice? Or is that just the practical reality of how you prosecute organized crime? You flip the soldiers to get the generals? Junior's book and public statements have consistently argued that the government's pursuit of him was more about his name than about evidence or justice. Getting a Gotti conviction would be career-defining for prosecutors. It would be a headline-grabbing victory. It would be revenge for the years when John Sr. beat cases and taunted the government. There's probably some truth to this. The Gotti name carries enormous weight in law enforcement circles. Taking down John Sr. was one of the FBI's greatest victories. Taking down Jr. too would have been icing on the cake. But it's also true that Jr. was, by his own admission, a high-ranking member of the Gambino crime family. He pleaded guilty to racketeering. He admitted to participating in criminal enterprises. The government wasn't pursuing an innocent man. They were pursuing someone who had already confessed to being a mobster. The question isn't whether Jr. was involved in crime. He clearly was. The question is whether he committed the specific crimes he was charged with in the later indictments, and whether he had truly left the life by the time he was being prosecuted. 4 juries answered that question with, "We're not sure." And in the American system, not sure means not guilty. Junior's story plays out against the backdrop of the Mafia's decline in America. The organization that his grandfather's generation built and his father's generation tried to maintain is, by the 2020s, a shadow of its former self. The 5 families still exist. The Gambino family is still active. But their power and reach is nothing like it was in the 1980s. Several factors contributed to this decline. RICO laws. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act gave prosecutors the ability to charge entire organizations as criminal enterprises. This meant that being a boss or high-ranking member became incredibly risky. You could be held responsible for crimes committed by your subordinates, even if you didn't directly order them. Electronic surveillance as technology improved. So did the FBI's ability to bug social clubs, homes, and even cars. The old mob practice of having important meetings in person became a liability when those meetings were being recorded. The breaking of Omerta, when Sammy the Bull flipped, he shattered the illusion that the code of silence was absolute. His defection opened the floodgates. If the underboss of the Gambino family could become a rat, anyone could, suddenly. Mobsters facing long sentences started doing the math. Is my loyalty to the family worth spending the rest of my life in prison? Generational change. The younger generation of Italian Americans had more legitimate opportunities than their parents and grandparents. College was accessible. Professional careers were possible. The Mafia, which had once been a path to respect and prosperity when few other paths were available, became less attractive. Competition. Other organized crime groups, Russian mobsters, Albanian crews, Asian triads, Latin American cartels moved into territories once controlled by the Italian-American Mafia. These groups were often more violent and more adaptable than the increasingly tradition-bound Italian families. Media exposure. Ironically, the same media attention that John Gotti courted ended up harming the Mafia as a whole. Every prosecution was front-page news. Every turncoat witness was profiled on TV. The mystique of the Mafia was replaced by a detailed understanding of how it actually operated, making it harder to recruit new members and easier for law enforcement to dismantle. By the time Jr. was released in 2009, the world he had entered in 1988 had fundamentally changed. The Gambino family that his father had ruled with such authority was fractured, weakened, and under constant law enforcement pressure. The glamour was gone. The power was diminished. The risk was higher than ever. Maybe that made it easier for Jr. to walk away. There wasn't much left to walk away from since 2009. John Angelo Gotti has lived quietly in Oyster Bay Cove, Long Island. By all public accounts, he has focused on his family, his business ventures, and his writing. He has not been charged with any new crimes. He has not been publicly linked to any Gambino family operations, to supporters. This is proof that Jr. really did leave the life. 15 years of living as a legitimate citizen. No new indictments. No evidence of continued criminal activity. At what point does a person's reformation become real? At what point do we accept that someone has changed? To skeptics, Junior's quiet life is simply evidence that he learned from his father's mistakes. Where John Sr. courted attention and publicity, Junior avoids it. Where John Sr. held court at the Ravenite for all to see, Junior conducts whatever business he conducts in private, far from FBI surveillance. The skeptics would argue that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we don't see Junior committing crimes doesn't mean he isn't involved somehow. The 2013 stabbing incident keeps that question alive. Was it really just Junior breaking up a random fight? Or was it something more? The fact that no clear answers emerged suggests that maybe there are aspects of Junior's life that remain deliberately opaque. But there's another possibility. Maybe Junior is exactly what he claims to be, a former mobster who genuinely left that life behind and is now trying to live legitimately while dealing with a past that won't completely let go. Maybe the stabbing really was random violence. Maybe old associates really do respect that he's out. Maybe he maintains relationships with people from his past without being involved in criminal activity. This ambiguity is perhaps appropriate for someone who spent decades in a world built on secrets and hidden meanings. What, in the end, is John Angelo Gotti's legacy? He is the son of the most famous mob boss in American history. He was the acting boss of the Gambino crime family during turbulent times. He survived 4 trials that could have sent him to prison for life. He walked away from the Mafia, or at least claims to have walked away, and built a life beyond organized crime. Unlike his father, Junior will not be remembered as a great mob boss. His tenure as acting boss was marked by difficulties and challenges. He wasn't the natural leader his father was. He didn't have the same charisma or ruthlessness or strategic brilliance, but maybe that's the point. Maybe Junior's legacy is precisely that he was ordinary in a world that demanded extraordinary, and that ordinariness saved him. He wasn't flashy enough to attract the obsessive media attention his father craved. He wasn't ruthless enough to inspire the same level of loyalty or fear. He wasn't ambitious enough to hold on to power at all costs. And so he survived. He survived when so many others, including his father, didn't. He survived not by being better at the game, but by recognizing when to stop playing. Junior's story is in many ways the inverse of his father's. John Gotti Sr.'s arc was classical tragedy, a rise from nothing to the pinnacle of power, followed by a fall back to imprisonment and death. It's Shakespearean in its drama, hubris leading to nemesis. Junior's arc is different. It's less dramatic, but perhaps more instructive. It's the story of someone who inherited power and chose to relinquish it, who faced the full might of the United States government and survived not by beating them in the streets, but by beating them in court 4 times, who recognized that his father's path led to only one destination and chose a different way. Whether that different way was complete withdrawal from crime or just a more careful approach to staying connected remains an open question. But Junior is alive, free, and with his family. His father died alone in a prison medical facility. By that measure, Junior made the better choice. Junior has been vocal about wanting his children to avoid the life. He has the advantage of being able to point to both his own experience and his father's as cautionary tales. This is what happens, he can tell them. This is the cost. His children carry one of the most famous names in American organized crime. When John Gotti III fights in an MMA cage, commentators inevitably mention his grandfather. When Junior's other children apply for jobs, go on dates, meet new people, they have to decide how much to reveal about their family history. There's a phenomenon in families affected by organized crime, the weight of the name. The Gotti name opens some doors and closes others. It generates assumptions and prejudices. It carries decades of baggage that Junior's children had no part in creating. Victoria Gotti, Junior's sister, wrote a memoir titled This Family of Mine that explored growing up as a Gotti. She later became a reality TV personality, using the family name to build a public career. She defended her father and brother publicly, maintaining family loyalty even as she pursued legitimate fame. Junior's approach has been different, more private, more protective of his children, more focused on keeping them out of the spotlight that destroyed his father. But you can't completely control legacy. The Gotti name will always mean something in American culture. It will always be associated with organized crime, with power, with violence, with a particular era in New York history. Junior's children and grandchildren will spend their lives explaining, justifying, or embracing that inheritance. The best Junior can do, the best any parent can do, is provide his children with options, with education, with legitimate opportunities. Whether they choose those opportunities or are drawn to the mystique of the family legacy is ultimately beyond his control. So far, the evidence suggests Junior has been successful. His children, with the exception of John III's very public MI career, have largely stayed out of trouble and out of the spotlight. That might be Junior's greatest achievement, not surviving 4 trials or leaving the mob, but raising children who won't repeat the cycle. What the story teaches us, John Angelo Gotti's story, illuminates several truths about America: crime, family, and legacy, the power of names. A name can be both gift and curse. The Gotti name gave Junior opportunities he never would have had otherwise. It also marked him for life, made him a target, and defined him in ways he had no control over. We are all, to some extent, defined by our families. But few families carry as much weight as the goddess. The limits of law enforcement. The government threw everything at Junior. Electronic surveillance. Cooperating witnesses. Multiple prosecutions. Unlimited resources. They couldn't get a conviction. This isn't a failure of the system. Exactly. The system worked as designed, with juries serving as a check on prosecutorial power. But it raises questions about the effectiveness of pouring endless resources into prosecuting one individual while actual violent criminals walk free in exchange for their testimony. The complexity of redemption. Can someone who has committed crimes truly change? American culture is conflicted on this question. We believe in second chances in theory, but we're skeptical of them in practice, especially for those involved in organized crime. Junior's case forces us to confront this question. If someone has paid their legal debt, he served 6 years, and then lived free of new charges for 15 years. At what point do we accept their reformation? Or do we never accept it, always suspecting they're just better at hiding their crimes? The erosion of omerta, the traditional Mafia code of silence, has been thoroughly destroyed. When underbosses flip, when made men testify, when the code that once defined organized crime becomes just a quaint relic, the organization itself loses much of its power. Junior grew up in a world where omerta was sacred. He lived to see it become negotiable. That transformation is one of the most significant developments in American organized crime history. The cost of loyalty. Junior's father died in prison, largely because he refused to cooperate or show remorse. He maintained his identity as a mob boss until the very end. That loyalty to the life and the code cost him his final years of freedom. Junior chose differently. He cooperated to an extent, pleading guilty, claiming to have left, and fought his cases using every legal tool available. His flexibility, his willingness to adapt rather than adhere rigidly to tradition, Is what saved him the American dream's dark side? The Gotti story is, in a twisted way, an American success story. Immigrant grandparents, poor parents, son who rises to power and wealth through hustle and ruthlessness. But it's also a cautionary tale about the limits of that success when it's built on crime. John Sr. achieved more power and fame than most people ever dream of. He died alone in a prison cell. The American dream promises that hard work and ambition lead to success. The Gotti story reminds us that success built on illegal foundations is inherently unstable. Family is both strength and trap. The Gotti family's loyalty to each other is remarkable. They stood by John Sr. through his trials. They stood by Jr. through his. Victoria defended them both publicly. This is family loyalty taken to an extreme that most of us can't imagine. But that same loyalty was also a trap. Jr. inherited a life he might not have chosen if his name had been anything other than Gotti. Family can be the source of our greatest strength and our most difficult challenges. It's now 2025. John Angelo Gotti is 61 years old, the same age his father was when he died. His father has been dead for over 2 decades. The Gambino crime family continues to exist, but is nothing like the organization John Sr. ruled. The old social clubs are either closed or converted to other uses. The wise guys who once filled the streets of Little Italy and Queens are dead. In prison or in witness protection, the world has moved on. Jr. has moved on, or so he claims. The fundamental question about John Angelo Gotti will probably never be definitively answered. Did he really leave the life in 1999? Or is he still connected in ways that are invisible to outsiders and unprovable in court? 4 juries couldn't answer that question to their unanimous satisfaction. The government tried for a decade and finally gave up. Journalists have investigated and found no smoking gun. Former associates have testified and provided contradictory accounts. Maybe the answer is that it doesn't matter anymore. Maybe what matters is that Jr. is free, that he's alive, that he's with his family, and that he's not currently engaged in activity that's bringing heat down on himself or anyone else. Or maybe the answer is that once you're in the Mafia, once you've taken that blood oath, once you've lived that life, you never fully leave. It becomes part of your identity, part of how you see the world. Part of how the world sees you. You can stop committing crimes. You can declare yourself out. You can live quietly and legitimately. But the life, in some sense, never completely leaves you. Jr. Gotti survived 4 trials. He beat the United States government in court 4 times. He walked away from a criminal empire. He wrote his story in his own words. He raised his children to have legitimate opportunities. By any measure, that's a remarkable achievement. Whether it's redemption or just successful image management, whether it's genuine transformation or clever concealment, perhaps that's for each observer to decide based on their own beliefs about human nature, justice, and the possibility of change. What's undeniable is this: John Angelo Gotti lived through one of the most dramatic periods in American organized crime history. He witnessed the rise and fall of the last great mob boss. He experienced the weight of inheriting a criminal dynasty. He faced the full prosecutorial power of the federal government and survived. He made choices, some forced, some willing, that determined the course of his life. And now, in his 60s, he lives quietly on Long Island, far from the streets where his father built his legend, far from the social clubs where his family wielded power, far from the courtrooms where his freedom hung in the balance. The shadow of his father will never completely fade. The Gotti name will always carry weight. The questions about his past and present will probably never be fully answered, But John Angelo Gotti is alive and free. In the world he came from, where so many end up dead or in prison, that alone is a victory, and perhaps that's enough. The story of John Angelo Gotti, the Teflon Son, is complete yet somehow unfinished. It's a story that spans 6 decades. From his birth in 1964 to the present day, it encompasses the rise and fall of American organized crime. It touches on themes of family, loyalty, violence, justice, redemption, and legacy. It's a story that asks difficult questions. Can you escape your past? Does redemption require transformation? Or just time and distance? What do we owe our families? And at what point does that obligation become destructive? How do we balance our understanding of someone's criminal past with their apparent legitimate present? Junior's story doesn't provide easy answers to these questions, but it forces us to confront them in the end. John Angelo Gotti represents something rare. A mob boss who survived not by defeating his enemies in the streets, not by staying one step ahead of the law forever, but by recognizing when to fight and when to walk away. By understanding that survival sometimes means surrender, his father went down fighting, maintaining his identity as the Dapper Don until the very end. Junior chose differently, whether that choice was motivated by pragmatism, fear, genuine moral transformation, or some combination of all three. Only Junior himself truly knows. What we know is this: a child born on Valentine's Day, 1964, into America's most notorious crime dynasty lived to see that dynasty crumble. He inherited a throne built on blood and violence. He sat on that throne for 7 tumultuous years. He faced the government's full prosecutorial might 4 times. He walked away free every single time. And he's still here, still alive, still with his family. In a world where so many stories end in tragedy, where the life almost always leads to prison or death, John Angelo Gotti's story is different. It's messy, it's ambiguous, it's unresolved in many ways. But he survived, and sometimes survival is victory enough. The saga of the Teflon Son is not just about crime and punishment. It's about fathers and sons, about the weight of expectations, about the possibility or impossibility of escape, and about what we leave behind for the next generation. Junior Gotti inherited his father's name and his father's world. Whether he successfully escaped that world or just became better at hiding within it, he has at least given his own children something his father never gave him: a choice. That might be John Angelo Gotti's true legacy. Not the crimes he committed or didn't commit, not the trials he survived, not the empire he inherited and let crumble, but the possibility he created for his children to choose a different path. Whether they take that path remains to be seen, but the fact that the path exists at all, that's something. And there you have it, the complete story of John Angelo Gotti, the Teflon Son, a man who inherited a criminal empire, survived 4 impossible trials, and walked away from the only life he'd ever known. This is one of the most fascinating stories in Mafia history. If you made it this far, you're a real one. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think Junior Gotti really left the life? Or was he just better at hiding it than his father? I want to hear your theories.